All right, happy Thursday, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about a few stories together. I don't know if you've noticed, but Tim O'Brien has chosen to write 4 stories now about Kiowa's death, right? We have Speaking of Courage, Notes, In the Field, which you read for today, and then today we're going to read Field Trip. And so here's what I want you to think about. Why tell one story, the story of the death of Kiowa, in so many different ways? Okay, so that's our focus. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to read Field Trip. Okay, so I'm going to read it aloud. It starts on page 173. If you would rather read it yourself, feel free to fast forward this and then just get to later in the slideshow. If you're good reading along with me, then let's do that. Field Trip. A few months after completing In the Field, I returned with my daughter to Vietnam, where we visited the site of Kiowa's death and where I looked for signs of forgiveness or personal grace or whatever else the land might offer. The field was still there, though not as I remembered it, much smaller, I thought, and not nearly so menacing. And in the bright sunlight, it was hard to picture what had happened on this ground some 20 years ago. Except for a few marshy spots along the river, everything was bone dry. No ghosts, just a flat, grassy field. The place was at peace. There were yellow butterflies, there was a breeze and a wide blue sky. Along the river, 2 old farmers stood in ankle-deep water, repairing the same narrow dike where we had laid out Kiowa's body after pulling him from the muck. Things were quiet. At one point, I remember one of the farmers looked up and shaded his eyes, staring across the field at us. Then after a time, he wiped his forehead and went back to work. I stood with my arms folded, feeling the grip of sentiment and time. Amazing, I thought. 20 years. Behind me in the Jeep, my daughter Kathleen sat waiting with a government interpreter, and now and then I would hear the 2 of them talking in soft voices. They were already fast friends. Neither of them, I think, understood what all this was about, why I'd insisted that we search out this spot. It had been a hard 2-hour ride from Quang Ngai City, bumpy dirt roads, and a hot August sun, ending up at an empty field on the edge of nowhere. I took out my camera, snapped a couple of pictures, and stood gazing out of the field. After a time, Kathleen got out of the Jeep and stood beside me. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think this place stinks. It smells like, God, I don't even know what. It smells rotten." "It sure does. I know that. So when can we go?" "Pretty soon," I said. She started to say something but then hesitated. Frowning, she squinted out at the field for a second, then shrugged and walked back to the Jeep. Kathleen had just turned 10, and this trip was a kind of birthday present, showing her the world, offering a small piece of her father's history. For the most part, she'd held up well, far better than I, and over the first 2 weeks she trooped along without complaint as we hit the obligatory tourist stops. Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum in Hanoi, a model farm outside Saigon, the tunnels at Cu Chi, the monuments and government offices and orphanages. Through most of this, Kathleen had seemed to enjoy the foreignness of it all, the exotic food and animals. And even during those periods of boredom and discomfort, she'd kept up a good-humored tolerance. At the same time, however, she seemed a bit puzzled. The war was as remote to her as cavemen and dinosaurs. One morning in Saigon, she'd asked what it was all about. "This whole war," she said. "Why was everybody so mad at everybody else?" I shook my head. They weren't mad exactly. Some people wanted one thing, other people wanted another thing. "What did you want?" "Nothing," I said. "To stay alive." "That's all?" "Yes." Kathleen sighed. "Well, I don't get it. I mean, how come you were even here in the first place?" "I don't know," I said, "because I had to be." "But why?" I tried to find something to tell her, but finally I shrugged and said, "It's a mystery, I guess. I don't know." For the rest of the day, she was very quiet. That night, though, just before bedtime, Kathleen put her hand on my shoulder and said, "You know something? Sometimes you're pretty weird, aren't you?" "Well, no," I said. "You are too." She pulled her hand away and frowned at me. "Like coming over here. Some dumb thing happens a long time ago, and you can't ever forget it." "And that's bad?" "No," she said. "That's weird." In the second week of August, near the end of our stay, I'd arranged for the side trip up to the Quang Ngai. The tourist stuff was fine, but from the start I'd wanted to take my daughter to the places I'd seen as a soldier. I wanted to show her the Vietnam that kept me awake at night, a shady trail outside the village of Mai Khe, a filthy old pigsty on the Battambang Peninsula, Our time was short, however, and choices had to be made, and in the end I decided to take her to this piece of ground where my friend Kiowa had died. It seemed appropriate, and besides, I had business here. Now, looking out at the field, I wondered if it was all a mistake. Everything was too ordinary. A quiet, sunny day, and the field was not the field I remembered. I pictured Kiowa's face, the way he used to smile, but all I felt was the awkwardness of remembering. Behind me, Kathleen let out a little giggle. The interpreter was showing her magic tricks. There were birds, butterflies, the soft rustlings of rural anywhere. Below in the earth, the relics of our presence were no doubt still there, the canteens and bandoliers and mess kits. This little field, I thought, had swallowed so much, my best friend, my pride, my belief in myself as a man of some small dignity and courage. Still, it was hard to find any real emotion. It simply wasn't there. After that long night in the rain, I'd seemed to grow cold inside, all the illusions gone, all the old ambitions and hopes for myself sucked away into the mud. Over the years, that coldness had never entirely disappeared. There were times in my life when I couldn't feel much, not sadness or pity or passion, and somehow I blamed this place for what I had become, and I blamed it for taking away the person I had once been. For 20 years, this field had embodied all the waste that was Vietnam, all the vulgarity and horror. Now it was just what it was, flat and dreary and unremarkable. I walked up toward the river, trying to pick out specific landmarks, but all I recognized was a small rise where Jimmy Cross had set up his command post that night. Nothing else. For a while I watched the two old farmers working under the hot sun. I took a few more photographs, waved at the farmers, then turned and moved back to the Jeep. Kathleen gave me a little nod. "Well," she said, "I hope you're having fun." "Sure. Can we go now?" "In a minute," I said. "Let's relax." At the back of the Jeep, I found the small cloth bundle I'd carried over from the States. Kathleen's eyes narrowed. "What's that stuff?" I told her. She glanced at the bundle again, then hopped out of the Jeep and followed me back to the field. We walked past Jimmy Cross's command post, past the spot where Kiowa had gone under, down to where the field dipped into the marshland along the river. I took off my shoes and socks. "Okay," Kathleen said. "What's going on?" "A quick swim." "Where?" "Right here," I said. "Stay put." She watched me unwrap the cloth bundle. Inside were Kiowa's old moccasins. I stripped down to my underwear, took off my wristwatch, and waded in. The water was warm against my feet. Instantly, I recognized the soft, fat feel of the bottom. The water here was 8 inches deep. Kathleen seemed nervous. She squinted at me, her hands fluttering. "Listen, this is stupid," she said. It can't even hardly get wet. How can you swim out there?" "I'll manage." "But it's not, God, it's not even water. It's like mush or something." She pinched her nose and watched me wade out to where the water reached my knees. Roughly here, I decided, was where Mitchell Sanders had found Kiowa's rucksack. I eased myself down, squatting at first, then sitting. There was again that sense of recognition. The water rose to mid-chest, a deep greenish brown, almost hot. Small water bugs skipped along the surface. Right here, I thought. Leaning forward, I reached in with the moccasins and wedged them into the soft bottom, letting them slide away. Tiny bubbles broke along the surface. I tried to think of something decent to say, something meaningful and right, but nothing came to me. I looked down into the field. "Well," I finally managed. "There it is." My voice surprised me. It had a rough, chalky sound, full of things I did not know were there. I wanted to tell Kiowa that he'd been a great friend, the very best, but all I could do was slap hands with the water. The sun made me squint. 20 years, a lot like yesterday, a lot like never. In a way, maybe I'd gone under with Kiowa, and now, after 2 decades, I'd mostly worked my way out. A hot afternoon, a bright August sun, and the war was over. For a few moments I could not bring myself to move, like waking from a summer nap, feeling lazy and sluggish, the world collecting itself around me. 50 meters up the field, one of the old farmers stood watching from along the dike. The man's face was dark and solemn. As we stared at each other, neither of us moving, I felt something go shut in my heart, while something else swung open. For a second I wondered if the old man might walk over to exchange a few war stories. But instead he picked up his shovel and raised it over his head and held it there for a time, grimly, like a flag. Then he brought the shovel down and said something to his friend and began digging into the hard, dry ground. I stood up and waded out of the water. "What a mess," Kathleen said. "All that gunk on your skin. You look like—" "Wait till I tell Mommy. She'll probably make you sleep in the garage." "You're right," I said. "Don't tell her." I pulled on my shoes, took my daughter's hand, and led her across the field toward the Jeep. Soft heat waves shimmied up out of the earth. When we reached the Jeep, Kathleen turned and glanced out at the field. "That old man," she said. "Is he mad at you or something?" "I hope not. He looks mad." "No," I said. "All that's finished." Okay, so when you're ready, I'm sharing this. I'm going to share this chart out on Classroom, and it's going to have editing rights for everyone. So at some point today, I want you to hop into this doc and contribute one thing. Okay, please don't fill every column and every line because this is supposed to be like crowdsourced. So as a class, we're going to complete this chart. Okay, so one contribution is all you need to do, but then I want you to check back on it. I'll probably share it back out maybe Monday and have you look through it and reflect a little more. So speaking of courage notes in the field trip, you're going to look at what does this chapter reveal, change, or add about the death of Kiowa. So again, just pick one thing to add to one of the columns or rows. Okay, so for example, I might add just something right here. Okay, and that's good. You might also add something about point of view. Again, this would be a different person contributing. So let's say Ashley puts something here, then Ryan, puts something here, and then Josh is going to put something here. Okay, so we're all just contributing one thing. And of course, you can add multiple examples, right, in any row. So if Ashley has already added here, it doesn't mean that more of you can't add another bullet point. Okay, so the second column is from what point of view is this story being told? And then the last one is some significant or compelling quotes. And then there's also here where you could contribute. Why tell this story in so many different ways? And you could add a thought. So really it's just a sentence or a quote, and this is nothing major. And then, as I said, maybe we'll return to it on Monday and just read through it and reflect on what we're seeing. Okay. All right. The last thing I want to show you is a review of point of view, just so we're clear on what you would be putting in that second column. So remember, a point of view is the narration of the story, right? So what narrative perspective is it being told from? So there's first person point of view. This is where the narrator is a character in the story. Think about On the Rainy River. Tim O'Brien, the character, is telling us his personal story. There is second person point of view, where the writer speaks to the audience, the reader directly, and says, you were there, you remember this, how would you feel? You will never see a whole chapter written in the you perspective in the second person, but watch for moments that are written in that point of view. And then there's third person. The narrator is outside of the story. I always think of it as like a narrator hovering above the story world and telling us. So they're going to use they, he, she. Another thing to think about is third person omniscient, if you remember that from junior high, which means all knowing. So we know what every character is feeling or what multiple characters are feeling. And then there's third person limited, which means that it's still they, he, she, but usually the narrator goes inside one person's perspective, and we know how that one person is feeling. Okay, so hopefully this is helpful with that second column. And another thing that's kind of special about the things they carried, we talked about metafiction on Tuesday, but the way he switches point of view chapter by chapter is also something that makes this book really unique. It's not something you typically see, and so it's something that is special to this book and this writer. And so I thought it would be helpful to look at that and think about why he is repeating this story with different point of views as well. Okay, all right. Enjoy today, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.